G'day, I'm Graham McCabe. I'm the founder of Step Advisory, a transport planning and traffic engineering firm, and have worked in consultancy and government for over 25 years across Australasia and Asia.
Hello, I'm Russell King. I'm a transport strategist and the founder of the Transport Leader blog and newsletter, and I've worked on the policy side of transport for around 20 years.
So we've created this podcast because we'd like you to join a global community of transport leaders, professionals, academics and advocates as we unpack transport's toughest challenges and spotlight on the strategies driving real change. From system reform levers and policy realities to sustainability and technological disruption, join us as we and our guests offer expert perspectives as we discuss ways to transform our transport systems. Russell, what are we talking about today?
Today, Graham, it's Stroads.
Stroads. What do you mean by Stroads, Russell?
Yeah, Stroads is one of those horrible concocted words that is a kind of concoction of a street and a road. And it comes out of a kind of thinking about how we think about our roads and our streets and the places. So kind of a movement and place mindset. So a street is a place where the focus is really on the shopping, the visiting, the using it as a locale for socializing and meeting people. That's kind of the street, and it's why you see frameworks like the Healthy Streets framework, which is about creating places that people want to be. A road, most people know what a road is, but it's about focusing on the movement side of things, getting people from A to B. A stroad is where it's a hybrid. It's not doing a good job on either. So it's not a great place to shop, and B, partly because of the traffic, because it's also doing the movement job. And so a stroad is a place where it's neither doing a great job on the movement side of things and not doing a great job on doing movement places. And they're all over the world. You see them all over the place, often with 4 lanes of traffic, 2 in each direction in at least in many locations, with shops along the side. And often these days, those shops are boarded up or it's a poor quality retail offering.
And historically, stroads have come about from streets evolving over time. So using local context of Sydney, we had streets that were widened when the tramways first came about, which then, when the tramways were removed, converted into stroads or roads. Do you want to talk about a little bit more about that historical and political context?
Yeah, I think when you widened it for the tramways, it probably worked quite well in the sense of the focus was on public transport then, but and people drove a lot less. And so there was much more of a sort of place-making function. But once you took the trams out, the focus was on the traffic and on the movement aspect of things. And so what's then happened is you've ended up often with parking on each side of the road to enable people to access the shops. And then you've got kind of 2 lanes of traffic. And then you often end up with buses in that traffic as well, because there's no room for the bus lanes to go. So the bus service is not very good. But the placemaking function deteriorates as well, because it's a congested place, it's noisy, it's polluted, it's not a nice place for people to linger. But it's very difficult to change those things for various reasons.
So how, in the terms of the economic versus movement and aspects of stroads, how do we get to a place where the movement is such a dominant feature?
I think it's probably less of a stroad impact than more of just a general orientation towards cars and car dependency that we've seen in many cities around the world, not just in where we're based in currently in Sydney. So you just see a real focus on historic traffic engineering is focused on throughput of cars. And so the lens very much on the road became, how can we get as many cars down this road as possible, as quickly as possible? And the aspects of the place on a stroad were really neglected and have been for several decades. And people are starting to now point those things out, and have done over the last sort of 20 or so years, and said, this is a messy compromise. It's not doing a great job on either of these functions. Are there things we can do? Now, there are a couple of very well-known Stroad corridors, and I'll say corridors in Sydney. One is Victoria Road, which is another road that leads into the CBD from up into sort of northwest Sydney, and another one that leads from Parramatta, which is the sort of geographical centre of Sydney, into the central business district, which is called Parramatta Road. And both of them are long corridors, often with 4 lanes of traffic, with parking, some partial bus lanes, but not continuous bus lanes, and shops that are, there's a lot of shops along those corridors. It's not continuous, but it'll be like shops, a few houses, a few warehouses, more shops, those sorts of things along the corridor.
And if we look at even the history of the last 20 years of these roads, back in 2002, when I was a junior traffic engineer, I was given the task of looking at Parramatta Road and trying to work out how to improve its efficiency. So Parramatta Road becomes the Great Western Highway and continues all the way up into the World Heritage listed Blue Mountains to the west of Sydney. So I spent months looking at how to increase capacity at each of the intersections along the corridor, and capacity was the only consideration. Capacity, delay, and travel time. So I think it really shows the evolution, not just in personal thinking, but in industry thinking, that we're now looking at how to actually transform these corridors back into great places, and there have been many attempts. Russell, do you want to talk about the different land use attempts at fixing these corridors, and particularly how does that influence political decision making from a policy perspective? Yeah.
I think the challenge is always, if you want to make great places, you need to reduce the amount of cars that are traveling through the place. And that's always politically controversial. And so that's why most Stroads exist around the place, is that even if your priority is to make it a great street again, because you're going to have to put in some forms of traffic calming measures, prioritize some form of public transport there, it becomes very controversial with car drivers and people who use that street. And so that's why it's so challenging to do it. So even with the greatest aspirations in the world to transform somewhere like Parramatta Road, and create lots of housing, lots of placemaking, lots of great amenity, it won't work unless you remove a significant chunk of the traffic off Parramatta Road. And that's typical of most Stroads, which is why most of them don't go anywhere, because the options for removing that traffic are very limited unless you're going to force people into public transport options. The reason that Parramatta Road is particularly topical is because we've effectively recently built a toll road underneath Parramatta Road, not quite, but effectively, which does the same trip but on a toll road that's a tunnel called WestConnex. And so lots of people have said, well, if we're going to build that tunnel, this is the perfect opportunity for us to remove the traffic from Parramatta Road. The traffic can use the tunnel as an alternative, and let's turn Parramatta Road from a Stroad into a proper street. Let's build lots of housing and amenity along that area and make it into a really nice corridor for place purposes as opposed to movement purposes.
Yeah, and it's very easy to convince somebody of the pain that they will feel, but not of the benefits to people who aren't already using that corridor. So if you say your journey will increase by 2 minutes, somebody can understand that. That's like, oh, I don't want that to happen. But if you say, well, we can have 10,000 extra people living along this corridor and it will have better cafes and parks and amenities, that same person's going to go, well, I don't care about that. You're making my life worse. So how do you convince a politician that the people who are saying to them directly, you're making my life worse,
Yeah,
that
it's a great.
those other people who don't have any investment in the outcome at this point in time are actually the more valuable people in terms of conversations.
Yeah, it's the political dynamic and great challenge. So you've got different sort of stakeholder groups here. So the stakeholder group that you've pointed out here is those that travel down the road currently, and they often don't live down that corridor. They're coming from outside of what you would want to be doing on that corridor, but they're using it, and so they're an important stakeholder. And if you were to put them down WestConnex as currently it is, they would go from having effectively a subsidized road in Parramatta Road to a tolled road on WestConnex, so they'd have to pay significant sums of money for using that road. So you can see how they would, even if you traffic calm Parramatta Road and their journey is delayed by however many minutes it is, their alternative is also very expensive. So they're not going to be particularly pleased unless you're able to get them an alternative public transport option, which may help to soften the blow. The second thing on their non-group is the businesses. And one of the things I think we make a big mistake on with a lot of transport changes is we don't explain to businesses the benefits they can achieve from transport change. So often one of the concerns for businesses when you're trying to convert a Stroad is parking availability. And actually what you're looking here is a vision for a street, which is very transformative. So it's transforming it from the model is that people drive and park outside the shop and go and shop to a place that attracts people in much larger numbers through public and active transport. There's more people living in the area. And so the patronage of the shops will significantly improve. But unless you spend a lot of time explaining that to businesses, they'll automatically feel loss of parking, that means loss of business, that's bad. Okay, they'll also be concerned about the transition period. So if you're transforming an area, that means a whole load of construction. That's not typically good for businesses. And if you're talking about a small business, cash flow is really important. And so if you're going to hit their cash flow for, hopefully only a short period of time when you're building, cycle lanes, better pedestrian facilities, etc., that will still impact them. So they'll have significant concerns. You need to deal with those. You've then got potential opposition from people who already live down that corridor because their area could potentially be rezoned, and they may find that if they're a renter at the moment, they may find that their home is going to be knocked down and something put in its place, so they may not be comfortable with that. Although homeowners are a slightly different question, is you have to handle them quite sensitively as well, because on the surface of things, a homeowner will go, well, you're going to rezone, there's going to be a whole lot of tower blocks next to my home or medium density housing next to my home. I don't want that. I want it to stay as single story dwellings. But the upside for them is potentially a significant uplift in the value of their home. And sometimes they understand the former, but not necessarily the latter. And so you need to make sure that you're communicating all of the impacts on them. But all of that makes it politically tricky.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and I think that's probably something that we should focus on in another podcast, in the communications messages around projects. Now, going back to the history of Parramatta Road in particular, there's been a lot of public transport proposals. I've personally worked on two of them over the years. One was as part of the Strategic Bus Corridors. Sorry, it's three Strategic Bus Corridors program back in the early 2000s. The Bus Priority Improvement program, infrastructure program in the 2010s, and also a light rail project. And all of these projects had an aspect of mode shift, improved priority towards buses, and the more recent ones such as the in a West council, so one of the local councils, trackless tram or light rail proposals to run down the centre of the road. That last one was probably more of a placemaking approach than the previous projects. They were still very movement focused, just prioritising the movement of public transport. All of those projects were defeated in the end by various factors, and we have a patchwork of bus lanes.
Yeah.
So again, going back to the policy and politics, the New South Wales government's just announced 10,000 homes will be along this corridor. We've heard this before. Do you think this time it will be different?
I think the problem at the moment is there is the homes vision, but there isn't a greater vision for the corridor. So they're okay with providing the homes, but it's not really talked about it as a place beyond just providing lots of housing. So the danger is what you end up with is the same Stroad problem that we have now, just with a lot more people living locally. And I don't think that's a very good outcome from a Sydney perspective. So the challenge is really, can they find a way of taking the public with them on tackling the Stroad itself, and then providing the housing and the amenity that you would want to see in creating a great place, which would then become a, potentially, and lots of people have gone with visions of what Parramatta Road could be if we can remove a large proportion of the traffic that goes through it.
Yeah, and when I compare Parramatta Road with Anzac Parade, so another Stroad in Sydney, so this one is in the southeastern suburbs.
We have a lot of them, don't we?
We do. So a short primer on Sydney's roads. All our roads are historically were radial. They were formed over the top of Aboriginal walking tracks, and progressively they got wider and in order to accommodate trams, and then they got even wider to accommodate cars. But Anzac Parade has gone in the opposite direction. They took out lanes, they put in trams, they didn't have the land use vision that was public. They may have had a land use vision that was not public, but it doesn't seem to have attracted the same level of angst and lack of action that Parramatta Road has. Was that because the people in southeastern Sydney were already using buses all the time, and it was their only form of public transport service, so that it was seen as an improvement, whereas Parramatta Road has a parallel heavy rail corridor, and if you don't want to get the bus, then you can make the effort and go, around about 1 kilometre south and hop on a train line, so you don't have that demand for improvement and better quality service.
I think it's a great question. I think the Anzac Parade one, when we put light rail in there, and I was in government when we were constructing that project. There was the factor for, it was a lot of people who were going to be benefiting from the light rail who are currently on buses. So that created a kind of constituency in favour of the project. But the other aspect was there was space on Anzac Parade without taking away a car lane for the light rail. So a lot of the Anzac Parade light rail, we ended up knocking down a whole bunch of trees to create space for the light rail, which was extremely controversial because they were, beautiful trees that you would, in an ideal world, want to be keeping, but sometimes it's challenging when you're building infrastructure. I think that made the made it easier. Whereas when Parramatta Road, you've got challenges when you get to closer to the CBD. It becomes 2 lanes in each direction, and no current bus lane. So if you want a good public transport option when you get close to the city, you really need to take a lane away on each side in order to provide priority for buses or light rail or trackless tram or whatever you think the right option is. So the question then becomes well, then you're going down to 1 lane of traffic from 2. Okay. And I think that the instinct for most people in decision making is that will be an extremely painful political process. And you will get people who are complaining about that in a big way and saying this is madness. And I think that's why to a large extent, it's been difficult. Now, people say, well, the alternative is you then go and purchase the space either side of the road, so you can then, create a dedicated lane without taking it away from traffic. But then that's extremely expensive land, really close to the CBD, and so your benefits case then drops through the floor because you're spending so much extra money on just land acquisition. And I think that's possibly one of the biggest rub points for decision makers in terms of biting the bullet here.
So when I think about the geography of Parramatta Road, there's two real choke points. One's in Leichhardt, where it, as you said, it narrows down to 2 lanes each way. But either side of that, it opens out again to 3 lanes each way. And then Anzac Parade, when you're going down into the Kensington area, you are going through similarly, formatted 6-lane roads with high density residential development. And from a transport planner's perspective, I think Parramatta Road's very much stuck in the chicken and egg scenario of the land use isn't there to necessitate the better public transport, but the land use won't come without the better public transport. So, again, you get stuck in that inertia of who's going to move first.
Yeah, and I think one of the theories the government might have, and the councils who have agreed to the significant increase in housing, is that they may feel that if they provide the extra housing, they'll have a very large constituency of people who will be in favour of public transport down that corridor, which then may change the dynamic for a public transport solution. I'm somewhat skeptical about that because I think the people who are going to lose and will be very vociferous about it, or at least going to have to change their behaviours, are people who won't be living there, and are people who live and drive down that corridor from outside of where those houses are going to be.
So, and in terms of the engineering perspective, I suppose also a little bit of the planning perspective, one of the conditions that was put on the WestConnex motorway was that there had to be bus lanes for the full length of Parramatta Road. Now, that's not going ahead for design reasons, is what has been suggested. So, and maybe this is a topic for another podcast, but I think there's also a risk-adverse nature within engineers and transport agencies these days to suck it and see a little bit in terms of making improvements.
Yeah, and I think that stems from the leadership at the top, to be honest with you. Both political and senior leadership within the transport agency, I think, are they willing to develop a plan which they feel is credible to actually make the changes and make it politically acceptable? And, I think if you were and I think this goes beyond the transport minister, I think it's really a premier call. It's such a big change. So in the same way when CBD light rail was being built and we were closing down George Street to put the light rail in, I don't think you could do that just off the back of a transport minister, although the original vision was very much led by Gladys Berejiklian when she was the transport minister, and then delivered by Andrew Constance when he was the Minister for Transport. You would never have done it without making sure that the Premier was 100% wedded to it because of the inevitable controversy you were going to have on the project. I think in terms of Parramatta Road, it's probably even more challenging politically. And if you're a Premier, you've got to go out and share a vision of why this is the right thing to do and why this is going to transform Parramatta Road and transform the city for the better, which I think it would be. And I think it would be once you've done it, I think everybody would go, why didn't we do this sooner? This is absolutely the right thing. But you're going to end up in the short term with a lot of challenges, and you've got to manage those as politically smartly as you can. And the question, I think, if you're a Premier is this your priority? Is this one of the things that you want to go down as for providing a legacy for Sydney?
And it's quite interesting because I was at City of Sydney when we were doing all the groundwork for the light rail, when no political party in state government was particularly interested in reintroducing light rail into the CBD. But once the decision was made, then I think it became even easier because you had that strong backing of a unified council that controlled a significant proportion of the streets that the project was running on, matched with a unified position from the leadership within the state government at the time. And with Parramatta Road, you have a unified position on the local government side of things, certainly out as far as the Inner West Council boundary in Ashfield. But you have a state government that is not committing towards investment in more transport projects at the moment. And the local councils can't make the change. They can't deliver a public transport project.
No, as I say, I think you need to have, the Premier, if he wants to do it, has to say, this is what I'm going to do. I think it's the legacy project, and you kind of have to go, right, how am I going to make this politically palatable or as palatable as possible? And I think, when we go back to those stakeholders, there's a whole bunch of things you can do. But let's assume that you are a Premier and you want to bite the bullet. You've done 3 times you've worked on this. What's the right solution in terms of transport? Is it BRT? Is it a normal bus service? Is it light rail? Is it a trackless tram? There's loads of different people proposing different options. What's your view on what we should be doing?
Yeah, so this is where transport planners and engineers, you have what are called modal agnostics, such as myself. The people who don't care about whether it's a bus, a trackless tram, a light metro, so long as it does the job that's appropriate for the context. And then you've got the people who love one of those types of vehicles. So the job that's appropriate for the context will come down to, what are you doing? Are you moving people from one end of the corridor to the other, with a few people getting on along the way, but they're all ending up at the same destination? That's what the buses are doing at the moment. So if you're not making new destinations where people who live along the corridor want to get on and off, then you would theoretically go for a bus vehicle, because dedicated bus lanes with express and local buses, they can carry a lot of people, around 16,000 people an hour if you're using high capacity buses like bendy buses or articulated buses. And that's for people who are going end to end. or to one destination, like at the moment. Whereas if you create new destinations, you want to be able to get people on and off the vehicles quickly. So standing for part of your journey doesn't become a barrier, particularly if you can get smooth acceleration and deceleration. And that's where you start getting into tram-like vehicles. In terms of trackless trams, they would be a step vehicle between an electric bus and a tracked tram, so steel wheel on steel rail. And you can't beat steel wheel on steel rail for energy efficiency. So all of these vehicles, if you started now, would be quiet. They would be pollution free, because if you're doing a high quality corridor, it's all electric.
Apart from, say, wheels emissions, but in terms of carbon emissions,
particulate emissions from tires are a very small thing. We can get into the fear, uncertainty, and doubt about electric vehicles and tires and brakes another time.
Let's do that. We'll do that as another podcast in the future.
So it really comes down to what you want to do. So if you're just building a whole heap of housing for people to commute to the city, and you're not making great places along the corridor, then a bus. Give people seats, give people comfortable seats that they can sit on for the entirety of the journey. If you want to have places where people are hopping on and off, then you need lots of people to be able to stand and get on and off quickly. So there's a turnover constantly. So then you're doing a tram type vehicle. And if you want to have really high density along the corridor, then put a light metro in over the top of it. So, and it's quite interesting because so many parts of the world have metros or light metros which are on viaducts within the middle of urban areas, and it's something that just is seen as untenable here. And if I think of the Vancouver SkyTrain, which weaves its way between high-rise buildings, and is a super frequent automated light metro, and costs far less per kilometre than what we're building in Sydney at the moment, and has a lot more stations on it. The range of opportunity is very different.
Okay, so I'm going to nail you to the mast, right? Let's assume that we're going to create great places along the Parramatta Road corridor, because I think if we were taking the traffic off, it would have to be creating great places and great shopping and amenities along that corridor. What would you choose? Which transport mode? Tram.
It'd be a tram, yeah, because with the level of density that is currently proposed, and then having that turnover of people, excuse me, having a tram would be the appropriate thing, because you're not trialing it. You already know it works as a public transport corridor, so you don't need to have a trackless tram. And I like trackless trams, but it's not we're not stepping up from nothing to a tram-like service to test it out to see if it'll work and have it run for 10 or 15 years.
Is there an argument on the cost side? I mean, trackless trams are a lot cheaper than what it costs to build light rail typically in Sydney.
So the real numbers, it's about 60% of the cost. So you do have a little bit of additional pavement where you still need to have all the same priority as a normal tram.
Yeah.
The vehicles are where the cost saving occurs. And that's because they're meeting a bus standard for a vehicle rather than a rail standard for a vehicle.
Do you still have to move the utilities? Because the utilities are one of the painful things about constructing light rail.
No, you don't. You don't have to move the utilities, but if you were putting light rail in the centre of Parramatta Road, I would be very surprised if there was any utilities there.
Okay.
If there's utilities, they are more likely to be on the sides, the curb side, the curb lanes. Yeah.
Okay.
So the utility removal or relocation would be significantly less than what occurred in the Sydney CBD. And
So let's imagine I'm a politician. I'm sitting there as the Minister for Transport and Roads. Okay. And you're coming to me and saying, my recommendation is you put a light rail down Parramatta Road. Okay. And I say, what will happen when we close one of the lanes where it's, bottlenecked with two lanes either side? Am I going to end up with a massive congestion problem? And if so, what can I do about it?
so the answer is no, you won't get a massive congestion problem. And I would say, Minister, when you look back at the closures for the CBD light rail, even closures for construction of parts of WestConnex, with good communication to the general public well in advance of any of the changes, people change what time they travel, they change what mode of travel they might use, and that could even be sharing a car. Doesn't necessarily mean giving up being in cars at all. Or they may choose to go to an alternate location. So, and we won't get into any of the technical aspects of how we know this occurs, but we do know that traffic evaporates when you reduce the capacity, and there will be teething when the closures happen, but then, like when a new road is opened, it will settle down into a normal behaviour.
Yeah. How long do you think that's settled?
How did that go?
How long do you think that settled down period is?
So most significant traffic changes, it's 2 weeks. It's as little as 2 weeks for people to get used to something, to a change occurring.
Yes. I remember when we closed CBD Light Rail, the headline in one of the local papers, front page, was Carmageddon. Because we wanted to get the message out around, now is not the time to be driving into the city. Use public transport, retime your journey, all those changes that you talked about.
Yeah, and having a little bit of a campaign to create a bit of angst is not necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of talk about the Sydney Olympics at the moment. And I remember the marketing was, if you drive anywhere in Sydney during the Olympics, you're going to have such a horrible time that you shouldn't do it. And I stood in the middle of Broadway, so 8-lane road at that time, at 8 p.m. at night, and there was 0 cars. Yeah. And I don't mean 0 cars like just because the lights had changed. I meant 0 cars, because the angst campaign had worked so well.
So should we get for another Olympics and use that period to just build loads of public transport on our roads and get rid of the Stroads we've got?
Well, we did build a lot of public transport on our roads. So we put in special Olympic lanes, and then we took them out again. Yeah. Because at that time, there was a concern that the holiday traffic that was occurring, because they did make it coincide with an extended school holiday period, would return to normal. But if they kept those things in place, those people, when they came back, they would have gone, this wasn't like this before. And then got home a little bit annoyed, a little bit less annoyed the following day, and so on, until it was they were just used to it.
Yeah. So
we could have had a legacy of a citywide completed bus lane network.
Yeah.
Now, if they just hadn't taken those lanes out.
Yeah. Now, in terms of Stroads more generally. So Parramatta Road's in a certain sort of special position in that there's been a new road that's an alternative for people to drive down, which kind of makes the argument for this is not a necessary, isn't required for a movement purpose anymore much easier. But if you're taking another Stroad, where most Stroads, are in a situation where a tunnel isn't being built as an alternative route for them, okay, what would you do? What would your advice be around Stroads? When would you go tackle the Stroad and turn it into a street? When would you say, it's no longer going to be, leave it as it is? When would you say, no, it needs to be prioritized on movement? When would you, how would you deal with those?
Yeah, so there's a really boring technical answer, which is you look at who's moving down that road and why, and also what the land use is. So you undertake a movement and place analysis. So you look at, is it a critical function that can't be replaced by either other roads or other modes? Is the land use, what's current and what's proposed, the type of land use that has a place function? And then within looking at the existing case and the desired case, there's a collection of street typologies that you would want to apply. So you may have an arterial function, so primary movement function, that goes through different places that have a place function, and then moves into another location where it's low density industrial or car dealerships or bulky goods retail that have very low place function, and then goes back into another town centre because of the way the streets and roads have evolved over time. And so you treat them differently. So you look at the town centre and you go, okay, well, yes, we acknowledge that this has a high movement function, but also has a high place function. So you lower the speed limit. You look at, can you do more street plantings? So street trees, those types of things. Can you make it work without having high speeds or high volumes of traffic? And then it goes back to being that other function. So nobody generally is traveling end to end along one of these Stroads. So you think about what are the opportunities to divert people around those high streets or high place function locations. And that's where things like town bypasses come into place. So Appin on the southwest outskirts of Sydney, they're now planning for a bypass of that because there's an arterial road that runs right through the middle of it, and there will be around 100,000 extra people living within that regional area. So there'll be more demand for car-based travel through that area. So the ways to accommodate that demand would be to either put on better public transport, acknowledge that there will be congestion in the town centre, remove the parking within the town centre, or do a bypass. So you can see how, depending on what your priorities are and what your objectives are, you come with a different outcome. So if your priority is focusing on sustainable transport, well then rather than having a bus that's infrequent, you would put in lots of really frequent buses that take people to where they want to go, acknowledging that some of those buses may not have many people on them. If your priority is about getting as many cars between point A and point B, and the town centre just happens to be in the way, then you would take out the car parking in the town centre. If your priority is about maintaining the place that is that town centre and acknowledging that will be a high level of car demand, then the bypass is what you focus on.
Excellent. Very helpful.
So we've got lots of Stroads all over the world. What should we be doing?
I think one of the challenges we have is if you look at the model for undoing Stroad generally, it's always controversial. You're prioritizing the place function in the 9 times out of 10 when there's a change to a Stroad. And the result of that is always controversial, right? You're removing parking, you're improving active and public transport links. You're asking people to change their habits. Often businesses are not necessarily brought into the change process yet. And so they end up then, as a difficult stakeholder. So I think when you look at all the places that do it, it's often with a very difficult political challenge, which is why it doesn't happen very often, right? Let's be honest about it. Most Stroads, the politicians decide to stay away from it and just leave it to be not very good at either. So I think it's unfortunately, I think the answer right now that I've got is, and it's not a great one, which is you're relying on political leadership to bite the bullet.
So how do the right type of political leaders in that area come about? So, you have I suppose the natural leaders in the area, the ones who want to change cities, and then the ones who are given responsibility for either land use or transport or both, and kind of fall into it. How do we go about educating the people who fall into it?
So I think one of the challenges you've got is these things often fall in between several politicians. So if you take in governance models, many cities have, is they separate urban planning out from transport. And the way that you need to solve these things is by integrating the transport and land use in these aspects. So if you take Parramatta Road, you talked earlier about the condition on the planning. It was the planning minister, Minister Stokes, Rob Stokes, who put that condition in. But the WestConnex was being led by the Minister for Roads, not the Minister for Transport. All right, and the Minister for Transport was a separate person. So you end up with kind of 3 interested ministers. And if you want to get that change through, you've kind of got to get all 3 of them aligned. And because it's going to be such a big political challenge, you've then got to add on a premier as well. So you've got a governance challenge of making sure you get everybody aligned who's going to be impacted. That's difficult enough as it is. And then you've got to be willing to take on the naysayers. I think the other models you end up with is where you have a very powerful, for example, mayor in a city, like Anne Hidalgo in Paris, for example, where she's been removing parking and building bike lanes all over the city. She's doing very well in terms of votes within the inner city of Paris, but the outer aspects of Paris where they have much higher levels of car dependency and they want to be able to drive their car into the city, she's much less popular.
Yeah, and that's, I would suggest, is the same with all of the cities in Australia when it comes to doing things to inner urban areas, and even Mayor Bloomberg in New York when they were developing the cycleways and changing Times Square and all the avenues. There was a lot of pushback from people who lived outside the city but commuted in, which we've also seen recently with the introduction of the congestion pricing.
you just have to look. His head of transport was Jeanette Sadiq Khan, and she wrote a book called Street Fight. Telling the story of how challenging it was to do those changes that you talked about, right? So yeah, it's not easy, and there doesn't seem to be an easier model at the moment. I think there are opportunities for some things to be made easier. I think one of the things I think we're not very good at is explain to businesses why creating a better place rather than prioritizing parking availability is a better outcome for them. All the evidence shows that is the case. When you create a better place, they get more business, right? Rather than focusing on prioritizing the parking. But they don't understand that straight away. And so you have to kind of go and explain that. So someone like Donald Shoup, who was sort of the father of parking reform, really, and pricing parking, would go and talk to businesses about why parking wasn't working for their town centre and how to reform it to get better outcomes. And at first the businesses would be skeptical, but then he'd explain to them what was going on, and then they'd be converted to asking for reform. Once you've got the businesses asking for reform, I think these changes in our Stroads and our high streets become much easier.
And having developed long-term plans and overseen the implementation of some of them, the role of long-term planning within a political environment. So if a strategy is developed under for want of a better term, a left-leaning government, a right-leaning government comes in, how much of that will carry through between the sides of politics?
So the way I would look at it is, ideally, your strategic plan will just talk about effectively, in terms of the infrastructure anyway, policy is a different aspect, but in terms of the infrastructure, it should really be a kind of series of, here's all of the things we should be doing. Here's the new rail lines, here's the bus rapid transit corridors, light rail corridors, etc., that we should be considering for new transport solutions. Okay. It might not necessarily say which one is going to be the first one that you're going to do or the next one that's on the list, because I think that's the political decision that you really want to get to, is kind of going, everyone agrees these are kind of the broad places that need to be done. It's then for the politicians to decide on the priority within that, and so they may go, well, this corridor here is not going to work for us politically, so we'll build this corridor over here, which we think is going to work for us politically. So why would a left-leaning government build a whole bunch of great transport solutions that only go down centre-right electorates that they don't think they've got any chance of winning, because they'll spend a lot of money and it's not going to be harvesting them many votes? But when the opposition party comes in, they may see that as one of their priority projects. I think the key thing with your strategic plans is to get what are the projects that need to be built in the city anyway, and then politicians left or right can prioritize which ones there are. Now that assumes that both sides prioritize public and active transport, because you should be including your active transport networks into this. And I think one of our challenges at the moment is, certainly in an Australian context, active transport is nowhere in the planning. It's kind of like a few high priority projects, but it's like rats and mice in terms of funding at the moment. And then public transport, it depends on where your government is in terms of its funding availability, but most governments in an Australian context, left and right, have been investing in building infrastructure, public transport infrastructure. Although roads are still very popular with both the centre left and centre right governments.
Yeah, and I think talking about funding, that's a whole podcast in itself, and the influence of lobbyists and industry groups. I think that'll be a fascinating topic to talk about.
We should do transport funding because I think it is there are so many different aspects of that.
Yeah.
I suspect it might be several podcasts. We might have to just break it down into different parts of types of funding and sort of, they'll end up with like fare box returns, operational efficiencies, infrastructure costs, value capture, alternative revenue streams, parking space levies, all sorts of other things that will come into that space.
Well, I think that's possibly a good point to leave this podcast and, give you the audience a sense of what we'll be doing in the future. We hope you have enjoyed this podcast. Please like, subscribe, comment across all of the media, and keep a lookout for our Patreon if you'd like us to keep doing this.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Graham. Good to talk to you, and thank you very much for listening.